We've just been playing around with some of the applique stitches that are for using the blanket stitch that's built into the machine. But next we're going to talk about the satin stitch. There is a built-in satin stitch. But before we get to this stitch, I want to show you why we don't use a zigzag. So stitch number 4 in the A menu is a zigzag, and you're going to discover that if you shorten it, it only goes down to 2.0 for length. So it doesn't ever close up that zigzag. And that's because there is a different stitch. In menu B, the applique stitches, stitch number 10, this stitch is designed different than a satin zigzag stitch and is the right stitch to use. Now, you can make this any width you want. You can narrow it and you can make it wider. Notice the stitch length has already been brought close together, but that might need a little bit more adjustment, closer or longer, depending on the thread thickness that you're using. So if you're using something finer like an embroidery weight thread or an Aurifil thread, you're definitely going to probably bump it down a little smaller so those stitches become a little bit more dense. With the thread I have in this machine, I am going to just leave it at the 0.8 and let's see what we're working with. Next, I am a fan of an open toe foot. So this is a foot that you can purchase separately from your Husqvarna Viking retailer, and that will let you see where you're going. So let's see here. Let's do about a 3.0 stitch width. And it is a centered needle position. Now, I mentioned there's a difference between the zigzag and the stitch. The zigzag actually travels forward. Each time it takes a zig and zag. But this stitch is going to go straight across, then down, straight across, then down. And it actually is going to give you a more filled in, uniformed look. So I'm always a fan of this built-in stitch. I like the stitch length. I'm also using a little fabric. I've got a little stabilizer that is key for an excellent look. Now there's one other thing that you can do with this stitch is because right now it's centered on the this center line, and that may not be exactly where you want it to be. So I want to show you a little trick. See this little white toggle switch? When you touch it, it goes from stitch width as an option to needle position. And what you can actually do is change where this stitch stitches within this foot. Let me show you. So see how I'm moving it to the left? Now that stitch is like left justified. So I could utilize one of the marks on my foot to follow along an edge, or I could go the opposite way. I can actually move the stitch to be lined up with any one of those hash marks. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So you can actually do this with any stitch, the blanket stitch or such. So right now, do you see how it's, oh yeah, I've moved it. I moved it all the way to the far, well, let's see here, far right. So if I go ahead and adjust my fabric so that line of the square I'm following is even with that right red hash mark. Now look where it's going to line up. And I don't even have to think about it. It's going to perfectly be guided. So I could have lined that up on any one of those stitches as it can shift from left to right or in the center. And look how perfect it would be. So I am always a fan of moving my needle position and changing the decorative stitch. Now the limitation would be is if you had a decorative stitch that was the full 7 millimeters wide of the foot, then of course you don't have any wiggle room. You would have to have a stitch that was narrower, like we were just talking about. We could also do that with the blanket stitch too. You can actually get that to move left or right because those are usually traditionally 3-4 millimeters wide. So try out the different settings. Know you might need to adjust your stitch length, and if you want to get real creative, try adjusting your needle position.